Please join me in welcoming Kristen Hassan-Arbach, Director of Animal Services at Pima Animal Care Center.
So we have a tech person in this presentation. We also have our Deputy Director, Sarah Aguilar. Sarah, wave. Sarah's going to be helping today because she lives in the world of shelter data. I, on the other hand, know nothing about shelter data. I find it really confusing. We are on Chameleon. Who's on Chameleon? Chameleon? How about Shelter Lab? Anybody Shelter Lab? Cool. What do we have? Pet Point? All right, Shelter Buddy? Something else. What else? Shelter Manager. Anybody on spreadsheets? Okay, cool. I got into being interested in data when I realized that more than half of my colleagues were lying about their numbers. And of those 50 to 60% who were lying about their numbers, half of them didn't know they were lying about their numbers. They really didn't know. They weren't lying. They just really were confused. And the biggest shock in animal welfare that you'll come across is that directors don't know what they're even doing. We live in this world of crisis, and we're so busy every day that we don't even know what our own data tells us. And a quick story about that. My first year in Pima County, I was really excited because we took in so many animals and we saved 91%. And I was like, I made it. I crossed this random 90% benchmark. We're doing really well. And I was so excited. So we made all this communication material. We announced it to the world. We went in the newspapers. And about a month later, Sarah came to me and she was like, so I have some bad news. And it took me a little while to process this, but it turned out when our fosters were dying in foster care, we were taking them back in as dead on arrival. So we weren't counting them as non-live outcomes. So our data was off by almost a full 2%, which bumped us below that 90% threshold, but also we had to go back and correct the record and tell people we really weren't as high as we thought we were. And I was thinking, if this can happen to me, who I think is so diligent and careful and goes and rants at everybody about transparency, if this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And so over the last couple of years, we've done a lot of work to get our data to a little bit more consistent place. And we've also noticed that no data, no intake and outcome types match. So we are all using totally different categories for intake and outcome. And thank goodness for Shelter Animals Count, who came in and brought some standardization. Are any of you on Shelter Animals Count? You're reporting your data in? That's a really important place to be sending your data, because what it's doing is it's not only are you sending your data, it's helping us have some consistency in the way that we're tracking data. But it's not the whole picture. So Shelter Animals Count and most of how we track data is really about intakes and outcomes, right? And we're not counting a lot of the other things we're gonna do. So that's what we're gonna talk about today, is how do we revision the way we do data? And I wanna learn as much from you as you learn from us. It is the end of the day, we're all exhausted. So we want your ideas, because I will start this presentation by saying we do not have any of the answers. We don't really know, but we know we need to rethink data, the big picture of shelter data. So in the really old days, animals weren't even counted or accounted for. So go way back when animals, remember when Alan talked about how pre-rabies animals were typically just being like shot if they were a problem? So in those old days, and communities caught up at different times, but those old days we weren't even counting animals. Then we get to the mid-1800s when they start to track shelter data. They start to count how many animals are coming into care and how many are dying. This is a slide from New York City in 1864 and 1865, and they would do these summer roundup and kill sessions. So in New York City at the time, what they would do is they would go out, they would get every stray dog, and then they would put them in this giant cage, and they would dunk the cage in the Hudson River, and all the animals would die. And so here we see from New York City the kill numbers. We had 1,154 animals come in a week. Dogs come in a week. Of those, 35 were redeemed, and 1,119 were drowned. In 1865, 913 came in, 66 were redeemed, and 829 were drowned. So that was the beginning. This is really the beginning of shelter data. And it's still interesting to me that we're still counting based on intake and outcome, even though, thank goodness, we've expanded outcome options beyond redeemed or died. And licensing emerged around this time too. How many of you have pet licensing? Does anyone know where it came from? It hasn't always been tied to rabies vaccines, although those histories evolved simultaneously in many places. If you go back to the early 1800s, so imagine this, okay? You're in New York City, you're walking around. At that time in New York City, there are more animals on the streets than people. There's pigs and dogs and cows, and animals are just living among people. This is true of all the big cities. But what starts to happen when you get a lot of people and a lot of animals? Animals become kind of more of a nuisance and a concern. And so what was happening is that in the old days, they would just shoot dogs. But what was happening in New York City and Boston and other cities like that is they were shooting dogs owned by wealthy people. They were shooting I don't know if standard poodles were around then. I think that they were, but they were shooting purebred animals, and that was making people mad. And the other thing that was happening was that they were also accidentally shooting people sometimes because it's urbanization, right? Cities are getting more crowded. So there's all these graphics around the time that showed that shooting dogs in the street was becoming problematic. At the same time, they started to bring in animal shelters because of rabies, start to bring in animals to these, what were called shelters, they were really just sheds, and start to kill them en masse. What's the problem with that? Sometimes you're going to drown a rich person's dog in the Hudson River and they're going to get really mad at you. And so licensing started actually as a way, it evolved around the same time as rabies, but it started as a way that people of means could identify their dog so that if it did get taken into one of these pounds, one of these kill houses, that animal would have a chance to get out. So does anybody remember Lady and the Tramp? Remember the scene in the pound? And the other dogs say to Lady that her identification is her golden ticket out of there, and that they're all hopeless because they don't have one, and that was reality. And the crazy part about it is that in the mid-1800s, the licensing fee was $1 to $2, which was more than many people made in a week or a month. So the licenses were only available to the wealthy. They couldn't be bought by poorer people, which meant only wealthy people's animals were initially licensed. But licensing from the beginning has been part of shelter data. We didn't want her pet getting taken to the shelter and killed, right? Because she's clearly going to throw a fit. And she's going to go to the mayor and the council member and complain about this. And so now she has a way to keep her dog safe. So the first wave of animal services data was that it was focused on this animal control model where animals are brought in, they have two ways to get out. So what are the two ways that animals could have gotten out in the early days of animal, when the dog pound as we know it existed? What were two ways animals could get out? Yeah, death or reclaim. So that's the two ways they could get out of the shelter. There were no adoptions. Nothing like that existed. They died or they were reclaimed by their owner. Interestingly, what we found when looking at PACS information, and this turned out to be true of a lot of shelters, there was another outcome option. Does anybody know what it was? What? Yeah, they could be transferred to research labs. And yeah, I am, yes. The research labs were the answer. So they could be transferred to research labs and used for experimentation. At PAC in Pima County in the 1970s, or 1960s, I'm sorry, dogs were actually being transferred to research. There were 700 transferred in a year. They were used for aerospace research. I don't even want to imagine what that means in the 1960s, but of course those dogs disappeared once they were transferred for research purposes. So this meant that shelter data at this time has intake. Almost all intake was stray intake. Like the idea of owner surrender wasn't really born yet. Shelters weren't quite seen as the place where you would take your animal if you needed help. It's almost all stray intake, and it was almost all coming off of animal control trucks. That's why have you heard us use this expression, animal protection? So we call our animal control animal protection, and we're trying to shift the language away from animal control, because really animal control was always just rounding up stray dogs, bringing them in the shelter. That's PAC, and you can see that's when we were called Pima Animal Control Center. So you have impound, from the beginning you have impound and you have disposition, and this is just for managing animals. But we start to add in, do you want to talk about this? Hollis Architecture, because that's what we're here to do, and I don't understand any of it.
Well, here's the good news. So I'm not an engineer, and I come from animal shelter operations, and that's how I joined Shelter Love, and this is what we had when I joined animal shelters in 1998. So hopefully I can bridge the gap a little bit and not keep it too technical. But here, when we started to track animals, it was still about animals as inventory, right? They're coming in and they're going out, and we're tracking what happens to them when they're in our care and they leave. Adoptions were not a focus. The adoption experience wasn't a focus, even though we could record who took that animal out when they left the shelter, whether it was a return to owner or an adoption. It wasn't about that customer-facing experience.
Right, so we're still just doing inventory management with the idea that a lot of animals aren't going to make it out alive. And I started in sheltering in '99. Were any of you working in the field then? We had some kind of shelter software. I can't remember what it was. Like, it doesn't have a name, I recall. Was it that?
That was ours. We had that.
Yeah, but it was not really focused. There wasn't an easy way to take comprehensive notes. It really wasn't focused on the animals as sentient beings. So then the second wave of sheltering comes along. So we had like the pound model. The first thing we started with was the pound model of sheltering. Very limited outcome options. Then we come into the second wave, and in my shelter, long before I got there, changed their name to Pima Animal Care Center versus Control Center. Have any of you had language shifts like that in the name of your organization? What was yours?
We were just animal control, now we're animal care.
Animal control shifting to animal care and control, and this is because we're starting to think about life-saving, we're starting to think about adoption. And so in these cases, it's no longer acceptable just to lose animals. You actually do need to think about the outcomes for most pets. And now we have this growing idea of the owner surrender, people bringing their animals for help. Because for the first time, people could bring their animals and it wasn't an immediate death sentence. In shelters, we have the emergence of humane societies who are starting to take animals. So the landscape's shifting a little bit, and we have an increase in outcome options. So you could be adopted, you could go to rescue, you could be euthanized, you could be returned. So more options for animals coming into shelters. But still, pets during this time, and this is pre-mid-90s, even, it's hard to like put decades on it because it evolved differently in different places depending on how urbanized places were and what part of the country they were in. But in a lot of places, pets with any issues were still automatically euthanized. So at our shelter, up until 2013, any animal that had a kennel cough, any animal that displayed socially inappropriate behavior, any animal that was shy or fearful, any animal with any sickness or any weird behavior was automatically euthanized at intake still. So we're still kind of pushing ourselves out of the pound model as we're thinking about saving more lives.
The technology changed a little bit by this time, where now we have the cloud. And before that time, you had to dedicate space in your shelter to servers. Has anyone ever shared a desk, an office space with servers? It's really hot and uncomfortable. And so now we don't have to do that anymore, and the data is in the cloud. And so that frees up space in the shelter that's so important for animals. And it also, at this point, we're starting to focus on adoptions and those people-focused programs. But what was different, and what we still didn't quite get at that point, was animals were still the foundation of software, both in the first and the second wave, and people are attached to them, right? So if I come in and I adopt one animal, I get attached to that record, and I might be attached to another record when I adopt an animal the next year. So at that point, we still had not quite adapted to people and animals are just as important in our software because we do touch them in many different ways with our programs.
Cool. I didn't know that. So when we were tracking intakes and outcomes, we're in the second wave of shelter software. We're tracking who comes in, who goes out. And we start to see a focus on live release rate. We start to look at things like length of stay. And we start to try to figure out what is happening at a macro level in shelters. When I started in '99, no one in my shelter, and this was probably different other places, but no one was talking about save rate. Like, that wasn't even a conversation. We were just focused on still managing population, but trying to recognize that individuals weren't just part of a herd. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, and I would, well, no is not right. Yes, I would. The other thing I would mention is the shelter I was at this time, it was a lot about that first step towards transparency. So even starting to talk about intakes and outcomes out loud was a really scary and forward movement for that area.
So if you were working in the field at a time when euthanasia rates were really high, some of you might have heard me tell this story before, but when I got into sheltering, my first day before I was allowed to start at the shelter, this is '99, I'm 20, I go in and I'm like, save lives! And my first day, they took like the cutest mom and puppies. She was like 30 pounds and her adorable puppies. And they made me hold them all for euthanasia. And they literally selected these animals. I'm not sure they would have died otherwise, but they selected what they said were the cutest animals because it was a test to see if you could handle the pain of working in animal welfare. So we still aren't, software's still not thinking really in terms of life-saving at that point. Like, it's just performing a function. At that time, we also saw as people are surrendering animals, we also see this conversation about owner-requested euthanasia. Because in the old days, any animal you surrendered was an owner-requested euthanasia. But they wanted to start to distinguish between pets that needed to be surrendered actually for humane euthanasia versus those that could be surrendered for potential adoption placement. How many of you have an intake category called owner surrender euthanasia, ORE, or owner requested euthanasia, ORE? You do, and you do. Anybody else? Okay, who here is pulling animals from a shelter that may or may not have a owner-requested euthanasia category? Is anybody saving those animals from other shelters? Awesome. So that's Vigo. So we don't take in owner-requested euthanasia anymore. As an open admission shelter, we take every animal. We got rid of the intake type totally, which is what got me started thinking a lot about what do we need to change about shelter software. Because we went through our data and we found that when we were taking animals in for owner-requested euthanasia, that we were euthanizing them 75% of the time within an hour of intake. What does that tell you? Yeah, we weren't evaluating them. Our people were seeing them. They were seeing that. And that is the power of shelter software. For me, it's why you're all here today, because it's sort of it hurts my heart that we still see shelters taking in healthy or treatable animals as ORE and euthanizing them. But the problem with it became that if they're not being assessed, that they're not getting a chance at a live outcome. Now that we don't take it, our save rate on those animals is 85%. So now that we don't take them in as owner-requested euthanasia, our veterinarians and our team aren't seeing them as somebody wants this animal to die, and so they're saving them more than 10 times than they were before. He was an owner-requested euthanasia who got a great home. I just thought he was so handsome with that chin. But here's the thing. The reason people are surrendering animals for euthanasia is they don't know that we offer this whole new world of services. And that's what we're really here to talk about today. Today, animal welfare has exploded into a world where we're truly trying to create more humane communities. And there are really good tracking mechanisms now. I mentioned Shelter Animals Count before because they're doing a great job tracking intakes and outcomes nationally and locally. So we have a lot more information. But the problem now is that so much of the work we're doing isn't just about intakes and outcomes. So I wondered if you all could name some things that you're doing. And Sarah, would you take the mic around for me?
I have one.
Okay, Sarah, can you name things you're doing that aren't in any way related to intakes and outcomes? Say who you are, where you're from, and then you get one sentence. So.
All right, so we're doing free spay and neuter for at-risk pets that were going to be turned into our shelter or that have come through our shelter, or animals that, say you brought in kittens, if you have the mom, we're doing that. So we're just trying to reduce population that way. And our ACOs also push the program on people when they go to homes that they see as at-risk homes.
Who are you and where?
Oh, sorry, I forgot. Robin from Anne Arundel County Animal Care and Control in Maryland.
Who else is doing things that are not about intakes or outcomes for animals in their community?
Hi, Elisa Brill from Paw Chicago. We have a community outreach program, so we're tracking all the animals that we're seeing to keep them in their homes. We provide spay and neuter program for them, transport them to our clinic. We do pet food pantry once a month. We track everything we give out at the pet food pantry in pounds, leashes, collars, everything. So we're tracking all that data.
I don't need to, I'm sorry, like, we do, we're tracking all that too, it's really exciting. I mean, well, I guess I will talk, like, it is exciting. Like, we're doing a lot of like the pet resource pantry and all that kind of stuff and trying to track outcomes, and I guess that's what my struggle is the outcome part of it. So I would love if we could talk about that a little bit. We get information from people, like what they need, and we give them stuff, but to how to actually see if that's keeping animals from coming in the shelter, I'm having trouble quantifying that.
Yeah, right. Like we're doing all these outreach and intake deferment and pet surrender prevention. Are any of you doing like surrender prevention programs? Yeah. Are they working? Do we know? How are we talking about them? What are we doing when somebody comes to our door and we provide them medical care and we help find them an apartment to live in, but we don't take that animal in? How are we talking about that as it relates to our shelter software system? Anybody else want to share something you're doing?
Santa Barbara County, we are doing vaccine clinics and making sure that we're microchipping every pet that the community brings to us on those clinics and tracking that information to see if they ever come in as a stray.
Cool. That's awesome. Okay, so you guys, you're probably all doing things that aren't about intakes and outcomes that we're not counting. And the problem, what is the problem what are the first two things people ask you about your organization? There's two questions you're going to get every time. What's your intake? What's your save rate? Right? Those are the first two questions you're going to answer about your organization. And those are really important metrics, but they're not telling the whole story. So that's where the third wave of shelter software comes in.
So there's a theme here, and the theme for me is people and programs have always been ahead of tools. And the tools are always trying to hurry to catch up. And so where tools are today is that they're now starting to look at what's happening outside the four walls of the shelter. As an example, tracking on a map, what's happening outside in the community before those animals get into the shelter. And is the points of care slide right after this one? No, okay, then I'll wait.
So if you're mapping things and doing maps, so right now we map distemper, and no, that's less interesting. We map fleas and ticks. Do you guys have problems with fleas and ticks? Who here does? Yes? Okay, I live in the desert, and for whatever reason, they're not really an issue. But in one zip code, everyone is covered in fleas and ticks. So we're mapping them out, and we're providing that service only in the places that they're a problem. That takes sophistication beyond what our shelter software can currently do. So these are the things that we want to start asking that go beyond intakes and outcomes. The first one is just, what did you do? What is the thing that you did to help that animal? Who was involved in that? It's often more than one person. Where did it happen? What was the impact? And what's changing?
One of the things that we learned with that map when we introduced it with our field services features is that we thought it would primarily be used by animal protection officers in the field, and right away our current customers who did not have those officers but did have colony management in some way or groups that they were working with TNR started to use that right away, and it's been just as frequently used for those groups as well.
So communities are already doing all of these services that have nothing to do with intakes and outcomes. Our shelter does 4 homeless outreach events a week, providing supplies and support to people experiencing homelessness. We're tackling hoarding cases in brand new ways, not taking the animals in always, but treating them in field. We're having animal protection officers return our pets before they come to the shelter. Do you know what the most interesting thing I've learned at AMPA is? Someone has been tracking how far dogs are roaming when they get loose. And he's finding that more than 90 to 95% of them are going fewer than 1,000 feet when they get loose. Fewer than 1,000 feet they're going from their homes, but we're driving them miles and miles to bring them into shelters instead of taking them home. So a lot of shelters are starting just to take animals home. We provide all kinds of low-cost services. We do foster care. So we do a program where if you find a stray animal, we'll send it home with you as a foster. So it's coming to the shelter, it's coming as an intake, but it's leaving immediately to go into a foster home. We're returning cats to their communities, we're doing outreach events, and we're providing pet support services. So this is one of our homeless clinics that you see happening here. So we need to figure out how to track the impact of these programs, because increasingly we're finding that it's not as simple as intakes and outcomes. Do you all have, one of the things we deal with are like repeat offenders. And it's not always an animal. Like an animal comes back into the system 4 or 5 times. Sometimes the owner goes to jail a couple of different times. Sometimes they're in transitional housing. Sometimes that pet is naughty and it gets adopted by 3 or 4 different people. But those are things that we need to be able to track a little bit more closely to tell us what programs are working and how are we solving complex community problems with our programs. And so shelter software hasn't quite caught up, and that's what we're grappling with and want to ask you about today.
So the challenge on the data side is how do we think about broad categories that can be built into the architecture of the system, but still allow for the unique programs that come about in a specific community. And this is an attempt to start to think about that, how it'd be structured. Because of course, when we're all together or when we're sharing data with the community, we have to have some standard language for it to be meaningful. So if you use the example of companion retention in the second line there, we know that you're tracking both your unique animals that there have been touches for, but also this idea of points of care. So perhaps as you're talking about repeat offenders, there's an animal that you've provided many services for, that animal and its family, and you need to track the animal, but also as many times as you've touched it with all of your programs. And that can be a proactive type of point of care that's before something, a negative event might happen, or reactive. And we want to be able to separate those as well for reporting.
So this would be a reflection of what a new way of tracking shelter data looks like, okay? So imagine that just try to I know I'm so tired. I know you guys are too. My brain is I'm spinning. So we've thought about so many cool things today, but imagine if this is what you logged into. I mean, it's hard for us to envision, but we need to start envisioning it because it's reality. It's what's happening on the ground. But what if this is what you logged into so that you know that temporary housing is replacing, quote, intake, right? We're temporarily housing the animal. And so, and that might mean that animal is going to go to boarding while the owner, we have a lot of people who, they need to go to the hospital and they don't have any family or friends. They're surrendering their pet now, but we're building systems where they can house them temporarily. So it'll change. By changing the shelter software, we can change what you imagine is possible. That's the goal. We want to help change, because if all we tell people, new people are coming into the field all the time, if all we're telling them is that intakes and outcomes are what's possible, they have to relearn all of this every time new people start. And if we had a shelter software system that looked like this, all of a sudden they're like, oh, I can avert pet relinquishment through community education. And I can actually track that. If I keep an animal out, I can actually track that into my data to show that as a metric. So the third wave, the whole focus has changed, right? It's focused on keeping pets in the community, on returning them when we can, on keeping them out, on getting every single darn cat back into the community. If it's not a cat, we're going to be able to adopt. All of these things are the future of how we're going to be doing the work. And so great, we have a new shelter software system. We can imagine what that's going to look like. And we can tell the story of all the things we're doing. So my annual report would look so much different. Like my annual report would say 400 people a day are visiting our shelter, 300 are coming for pet support services, 100 are coming to foster or adopt. Here's who's leaving with who. In the field, we have our community outreach person. She is making contact with 17 to 20 pet owners a day. She's providing fencing support for this many people. Imagine how different what we'd be telling the community looks like, right? We would be telling the community this great big story about what we're doing that we're just not quite able to tell yet. And that is the goal. Now that I've said that, the question I have for you all, the problem and where I get stuck, is that finally we have a national organization who's bringing together all this data. We have the Best Friends Community Data Dashboard showing where communities' live release rates are. So we have this transparency we've never had before. And I think the challenge with something like this is if we move into this third wave of shelter software, it becomes even easier for people to hide their euthanasia numbers. You could bury your euthanasia numbers and how much community service you're doing. You could manipulate your data more because it will be more complex. And that's where we're a little bit stuck in thinking, do we want to envision this, or does this open us up into unintended consequences? This was a good example of why shelter software being limited now is a problem. The newspaper, our local newspaper, came out to do a story on our animal protection, and we were super excited. But this ended up being the title of the story: Heavy Workload and Legal Limitations Mark Role of County's Animal Protection Officers. And we were so disappointed because while we told them all these cool stories, we drove them around, we showed them all the things we're doing, we had very limited statistical data to give them. Like, all we were able to say to them is that we issued 3,500 citations, that 647 citations, that the number of citations had dropped, and our live release rate. But because that was the data that we provided, we ended up not being able to tell the full story and getting this headline. And that leads to community misunderstanding about what we do. And so that's what we need to change, is the fact that so much of our work is going unnoticed but we need to change that because we need to change that without getting rid of the integrity of the life-saving data. Why does this all matter, and why should it matter to you? Because you're struggling to get resources because people don't understand everything you're doing. If your community, your governments knew how much you're doing, you would probably be more able to get resources because they would see your role like parks, or they would see how expansive it is, how you're all over the community. So, Sarah, can you hop in here and talk a little bit about what you saw in our data and what you wish we saw in what you wish you could do with shelter software that you can't do now?
Sure. I probably should move to the front. So one of my very favorite things to do is dump a whole bunch of data into a spreadsheet and look for things. It's not really fast. I don't really have time to do it. I wish I didn't have to do it. I wish I could just plug in questions into software and it would spit things out. One of the things that we looked at recently was intake from same addresses over a 10-year period, and found that we've got houses that sort of fly under the radar because maybe 7 animals come in a year, probably not all at the same time, but that they come in every year. So all of a sudden we have a house that's given us 100 animals, and we never considered it to be something that might need attention. I think
you talk about the day-to-day intake thing that you did?
Yes. One of the things that was really exciting for our staff is I put together our census at 6 a.m. every morning, dogs and cats for 2 years, and compared from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday. Did we have an increase in dogs? Did we have a decrease in cats? And then compared January 1st, 2018 to January 1st, 2019. And all of this is in one big spreadsheet. And then started highlighting days that we have over 400 dogs are orange. Days that we have over 450 dogs are red. Days that we have a decrease in cats are green. Days that we have an increase of more than 10 are red. Trying to look for some patterns. And so this year, as we headed into October and we thought, oh, summer's over, things are going to get easier. And I told everybody, oh no, we've got like 2 really hard weeks coming up. And everybody went, why? Like summer's over. I said, well, because we've had this as a pattern now. And we don't know why. But sure enough, in October, boom, census goes up. We have high intake for 2 weeks. We wouldn't know that. Like shelter software doesn't spit that out for you. You have to actually go in and look for patterns. And so having changes come up is going to be amazing.
So the problem becomes that once Sarah did that, she mapped another thing, which was all evictions happening in the community and how that mapped on intake. We're mapping things like, we're looking at where humans are unvaccinated, animals are also unvaccinated. That's wild and so important. But imagine a sheltered data system that showed us all this. Right now, it's taking her copious amounts of time to ask really important data questions that lead us to change everything we do. Now, we look at Sarah's chart, which is like this tall, and we go to the day and we say, we better prepare because the last couple of years have shown us that we're going to be over capacity on cats. But we're not even really, unless you have a Sarah, you're not really even able to ask these questions right now. It's all reactive. And we're just looking at these blanket intake and outcome numbers. So the future of shelter data is going to let us ask more critical questions so that we can critically think about solutions. I think that, hashtag foster is the future. If you're not on the Animal Shelter Foster Innovation Facebook group, please join. It's where we talk about everything related to animal shelter foster care. I showed this chart on the first day. It makes me really happy. You can see as foster goes up, euthanasia goes down. And it's undeniable, shelter after shelter after shelter are showing us that foster is the future of animal welfare. But nobody really knows how to tackle foster. Do we outcome them to foster? Do we not? We don't really know what to do with them. Do we count them in length of stay? None of these questions are really being answered because we're just moving so fast, right? Is my count unique animals that went to foster? Or does this number show us just the number of times an animal was placed in foster, which would double count animals to foster? All these questions, because we're not asking them, we're not seeing consistency in data, and we're not able to... 5 minutes, huh? So I'll give you one last future slide, okay? That's my community. You don't know what that means. It looks like blobs, but that's Pima County. And you can see these are hotspots of intake. So we're GIS mapping out where our intake's coming. But when you zoom in on this map and you zoom in, you can get to street by street level. You can see that a lot of your big dogs are coming from one block on one street in a neighborhood. And you can start to figure out, how do we target services? Instead of doing these blanket services to everyone and everywhere, how do we start to target services down to that street where those animals are coming from? We cannot solve poverty. We have to be careful as a movement not to take all those resources out of the shelter and just throw them into the community. We will not make the numbers. We can't keep up. But what we can do is we can figure out where are the spots that are causing the biggest problem for the shelter and how do we target services there. But we've got to get the data to be able to ask those questions. And once we ask them, we can do things like our flea and tick preventative. We're going to be able to potentially eradicate fleas and ticks because we're not just dispersing things everywhere. We're putting them where they're really needed. The last graph is something I also showed on the first day. This is our intake due to eviction, and this is another thing that Sarah plotted. And we think that shelter intake is a canary in the coal mine. We think it's telling us about social problems, about coming recessions, about where people are being moved from their community due to gentrification, due to housing shifts, due to restrictions on pet accessible housing. But we need to know this data so that we can prepare and we can respond to it accurately. That graph I take to every single meeting I go to in Pima County, and I share it with people, and we're now mapping it on to graphs dealing with human transients and people, what's happening to people in the places where these evictions are happening. So I'm sorry we ran out of time because I did want to ask you more questions, and we're not going to have time, but I hope that what we leave you with is knowing that we're looking, intakes and outcomes are a tiny little snapshot, but they're an important one because they tell us what is living and dying in the shelter. We need to add on and create a much bigger world of data that doesn't just depend on those intakes and outcomes while maintaining the integrity. So if you have ideas and want to talk about that, these two are way smarter than me about it. And we need to be talking about this as an industry because we're selling ourselves short and we're not telling our stories. Thank you.